I'm sure that all of us, all of you, will recognize the fact that when we're on the doorstep, when we're canvassing, when we're recruiting for communism, probably the kind of last resort and clinching argument we get from so many people is, well, yes, that would be very nice, wouldn't it? It would be very nice if we could all share and be in harmony and one world, and no more conflict, no more war, all the stresses that we're under. Communism sounds a good idea, but you know, we've got to face it. Human nature is just not going to make it possible. I mean, not even no legislation by some government, some left-wing government, not even a revolution can change human nature. And I think we all know that that is a widespread argument. And that's, I think, why it was so important to Marx and Engels to counter that argument right from the outset. And I'm sure everyone here knows the degree to which Marx's early writings were precisely on human nature. Paris manuscripts were essentially, that's what they were. They were kind of anthropology, I suppose. What does it mean to be human? And of course, Marx and Engels were arguing that actually, I mean, I remember one of the short sentences in one of the Paris manuscripts is that to the extent that we are human, to the extent that our instincts and feelings are human, this is just a little sentence I remember, the enjoyment of the other person is our own enjoyment. Because we're social creatures, we gain pleasure from being able to give pleasure to others. It's kind of a rather sad state if you're unable to do that. And that was right from the very outset. And it meant, of course, that much later, of course, when Lewis Henry Morgan produced his extraordinary work on the Iroquois Indians, systems of consanguinity and affinity of the human family, and then ancient society, demonstrating that right across North America, with particular reference, of course, to the Iroquois, the people there were essentially communists. I mean, they're just quite obvious that to simply describe them as egalitarian or having a sharing lifestyle was just not sufficient. There's no question about it. These were people whose communism just came naturally to them, and it was just kind of indignation that the various Westerners who were turning up and trying to teach them civilization, various missionaries and so on, indignation that they were being asked to accept what seemed to them a completely alien ethos. So, I mean, we're all familiar with the fact that for Marx and Engels, the future communism would be a return on a higher level of the freedom, equality, and the freedom and equality of the Iroquois clan. We'd be returning to that kind of communism, obviously not in great specific detail. So those here who want to know about what communism actually is, this is a wonderful book. It's Alain Testard, Le Communisme Primitif, Economy and Ideology, of course. It's kind of the classic text, I suppose, these days on this topic, obviously written quite a while ago, and unfortunately in French and never been translated. But one of the things about what was called at that stage primitive communism, I think your title is a lot better, original communism, is that although it's based on laughter and sort of demand sharing, people just have a feeling that one should be communist, you shouldn't try to lord it over other people, that it's just kind of immoral. In addition to that, what Testard is pointing out is that there's a kind of final block on any kind of accumulation of property, and that block is a kind of taboo. It's a prohibition, and he's just writing in this throughout this book actually that what appears to many of us today, if we're not, don't look into it properly, what appear to be kind of irrational taboos are actually quite rational methods of making sure that some things are sacred and certain red lines must not be crossed. And it's no accident that those lines are red. And it's what Testa calls an ideology of blood. Blood marks things as sacred. So when you kill an animal, it's bleeding. And that blood marks that animal as in some sense inviolable and sacred. You can be very respectful of its blood. And the same notion of the sanctity of blood applies to the blood of women. The blood of women, the blood of the hunt are kind of linked together in this, what Testa calls an ideology of blood. And you can just see how critically important it was for a species, our species, evolving. And people often talk about man, the tool maker. You have to remember those tools weren't carpentry tools. They weren't saws and chisels. They were weapons, means of shedding blood. And anyone who knows anything about non-human primates, particularly our closest great ape cousins, the chimpanzees, will know the extent to which a chimpanzee, particularly a male chimpanzee, armed with weapons, would wreak havoc all around. And of course, chimpanzees don't have a concept of the sacred. They don't have the idea that certain things, the kind of red line you mustn't cross. I mean, and male chimpanzees are very competitive. There's extreme forms of male dominance. There's no such thing as an incest taboo. Older brothers and fathers will sexually coerce their own female relatives. Very often, of course, those females fight back. But I mean, it's perfectly clear that if we were evolving with ever more efficient weapons of, if you like, mass destruction, which of course they would have been, then without very, very rigorous system of taboos on the shedding of blood and the abuse of blood, our species wouldn't have survived. We would have gone extinct. I mean, there's no question about that. So it's a kind of long argument to go into exactly what happened. And of course, I've written a book about it, Blood Relations, my book. But what I'm saying here is there's a connection between the concepts of the sacred and communism, the idea that there are certain red lines. And of course, in my book, I kind of elaborate on Testa's idea and point out that ultimately, the red line is a good way to think about the red lines that hunter-gatherers observe is to think of in our own culture today, certain red lines, which obviously some people think of as irrational, but we can see a logic behind them. So a good example of a kind of taboo that all of us should be familiar with, I think we're probably, in this context, all of you here will be familiar with, is what you don't do is cross a picket line. You never cross a picket line. And it's sort of a taboo, and we could be accused of being a bit irrational because we kind of say, well, if it's a picket line, you don't cross it. You don't see it. Well, is there 6 people on it, or 9, or only 3? How physically could I cross it? How fast would I have to run or something? I mean, it's just it's a picket line. You don't cross it. It's kind of a taboo, and it's just so, I don't know, interesting and lovely actually what's happening now. That so many younger people that have never been on a picket line before, right as we speak, all over this country, and of course we're not the only one. People are recognizing there's a reason why you don't cross a picket line. It's because you don't want to be perceived as a cheat. You don't cheat on your brothers and sisters. And of course, in my book, I point out that the idea of a picket line goes way back before the Industrial Revolution. There are all sorts of examples of picket lines going right back through history, right into prehistory. And in the very earliest stages, for reasons which Engels and Marx themselves were quite explicit about, particularly Engels, of course, in The Origin of the Family, Private Property in the State, when he didn't have class in the modern sense of the term, you had sex. And as Engels pointed out, in so many interesting ways, the female of the species is kind of the working class in the sense that it's the female that does the reproduction, all the hard work of reproduction, the pregnancy, the childbirth, the breastfeeding and stuff. And in a certain sense, just biologically, the male is the privileged sex. Doesn't take a lot of energy or time or cost to get somebody pregnant. And there's a kind of if anyone who thinks that the dialectic of nature is part of the dialectic, anyone who agrees with Marx and Engels that the dialectic is not just a characteristic of history, but of nature as well, will see the logic of those parallels. And so the earliest picket lines would certainly have been sexual picket lines. And in my book, of course, I talk about sex strike. And perhaps I should just emphasize that sex strike is not a theory. It's actually what happens. It's just hunter-gatherers have a system. Their economic system is known as bride service. A man never gains property rights in a woman. He never even, there's no such thing as a marriage. A man can't say, oh, I've got conjugal rights in this woman because I've married her. You have bride service. And bride service means that a young man, if he wants some sex, he better go and visit somebody, somebody he fancies, not too far away. And he's got to make sure that he's accepted by the young woman and her family by making himself useful. So bride service means if it's a hunting and gathering economy, the man must hunt, prove himself a reliable, generous hunter, modest hunter as well, mustn't brag about anything. And as soon as he proves himself lazy or incompetent or useless or in any way harassing his partner, he's out. She lives with her mum because she needs to be with her mum and relatives to help her with childcare, especially with as the first child is born. And bride service is just, I mean, in some sense, I just gave another word for it. I used the word sex strike instead of bride service because bride service isn't a very it's in our sort of Western terminology, it's not very much known. But the fact that a man never has conjugal rights in a woman, he's got to keep on earning his keep, if you like, and he can be thrown out at any time, is what I'm talking about here. If his sexual rights are not categorical, he'd be thrown out. And of course, Engels talks about that when he discusses the Iroquois. I won't go through the quote, but he points out that, that any young man who's married into the Iroquois longhouse, as soon as he's proving to be kind of lazy or useless, he's out. He's just thrown out, and he has to go back to his own longhouse, where he will have rights, of course, to children and everything else, his sister's children, and so that idea that he's got no conjugal rights, is his sexual relationship can be ended at any time by his partner and her sisters and brothers, is what I'm talking about when I use that term. And it just so happens that there are logical reasons why, in particular, there's a kind of periodicity to that action. And the periodicity has a lot to do with the menstrual cycle. When women are menstruating, they're kind of taboo, and it's a way of keeping men on their toes to convince them that they don't have a sort of permanent marital right in their wife. So what we see in the West, absolutely logically, menstrual taboos as kind of oppressive and so on. We can absolutely easily see, anyone who's interested in the topic, that originally that wasn't the case, that women were able to synchronize their menstrual cycles with the moon. The whole of life and culture was hugely influenced by both the sun and the moon. Those are the only clocks people had, and the whole system made a lot of sense. So one way I think to emphasize the importance of all this these days is to take a book which is far more widely read and popular than anything I've written. It's David Graeber's book, Debt, and to see how this really influential book, obviously followed up by The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity, David Graeber and David Wengrow, massively well publicized volume. So we have these two volumes. David Graeber I knew very well before he died, of course, tragically a couple of years ago. He's an activist who I've found myself often on picket lines with, or on other demonstrations with. But here is Graeber's view of the theory of primitive communism. Our thinking about communism has been dominated by a myth. Once upon a time, humans held all things in common. In the Garden of Eden, during the golden age of Saturn, in Paleolithic hunter-gatherer bands. Then came the fall, as a result of which we are now cursed with divisions of power and private property. The dream was that someday, with the advance of technology and general prosperity, with social revolution or the guidance of the party, we would finally be in a position to put things back, to restore common ownership and common management of collective resources. Throughout the last 2 centuries, communists and anti-communists argued over how plausible this picture was and whether it would be a blessing or a nightmare. But they all agreed on the basic framework. Communism was about collective property. Primitive communism did once exist in the distant past, and someday it might return. We might call this mythic communism or even epic communism, a story we like to tell ourselves. Since the days of the French Revolution, it has inspired millions, but it has also done enormous damage to humanity. It's high time, I think, to brush the entire argument aside. So for Graeber, the thing which has done such damage to humanity, and I presume he means all the different world wars we've had and all the political and social disasters we've had, he attributes them to the idea that we were once communists. And so he goes on, it's high time, I think, to brush the entire argument aside. In fact, and now he comes to his own view, communism is not some magical utopia, and neither does it have anything to do with ownership of the means of production. It is something that exists right now, that exists to some degree in any human society, although there has never been one in which everything has been organized in that way, and it would be difficult to imagine how there could be. All of us act like communists a good deal of the time. None of us acts like the communists consistently. Communist society, in the sense of a society organized exclusively on that single principle, could never exist. But all social systems, even economic systems like capitalism, have always been built on top of a bedrock of actually existing communism. And then he says, starting, as I say, from the principle of from each according to their abilities to each according to their needs, this allows us to look past the question of private ownership and to much more immediate and practical questions. And what it goes on to say is that if you're some corporate manager, hedge fund manager or something in the city, and you buy your mate a drink because you know that he needs one, then this principle, from each according to their abilities to each according to their needs, you only buy somebody a drink if you can afford it, and they will only buy you a drink back if they can afford it. So for Graeber, that's communism. It's got nothing to do with the ownership of property. And it's kind of a little bit difficult to know quite what to do with this argument. Obviously, he's right to say that all of us humans in our daily lives are kind of communists and in so many different ways. And he points out, of course, that that capitalism couldn't survive except on this baseline communism that all of us instinctively understand and share. All of us, do all sorts of things in our jobs way beyond what's in the rule book, what we're actually paid specifically, sort of minute by minute, to actually do. We're social creatures. We help each other out, and capitalism couldn't survive if we were fully 100% capitalists through and through. And he's also kind of right in the sense that when he says some of the time, not all the time, there's a certain sense in which, as I've actually just mentioned it, in which the kind of communism of hunter-gatherers in Africa and other places today, there is certainly a certain kind of periodicity to it. There's a kind of periods of intense communism. Anthropologists link that to periods of what one anthropologist called communitas. This is Victor Turner's concept. The whole community gets together. Usually it's conceptualized as some kind of ecstatic or religious experience of communion. Everyone's singing, dancing. And so that's an intense form of communism, but it doesn't last forever. Then people sort of come down from all of that, having made the point, having bonded very closely through the singing and the dancing and the other aspects of ritual. And then they get back into their sort of ordinary, if you like, secular lives, and are more informal and more separate. So there's certainly an up and down periodicity to real communism. It needs to be reinforced, and then on the other hand, everyone wants to relax a bit and have a bit of sort of personal free time on their own, maybe. And on that basis, Graeber argues that if there were such a thing as communism, which was kind of continuous and fixed, it would be very boring and oppressive. And so in The Dawn of Everything, again, I won't get the page numbers and do the quotes, it'll take too long. He says, well, what would have happened would be if humans being humans, we would have wanted a break from capitalism and then had a period of despotism for maybe a few centuries, because it gets very boring if you have a single system imposed permanently. And so they have Wenger and Graeber in The Dawn of Everything, they have this idea of a kind of pendulum of movement between opposite political extremes. So you get despotism, warfare, maybe cannibalism, human sacrifice and stuff, and then everyone gets fed up with that, and they have a period of something like communism for a while. But then that gets a bit boring, and because humans like to have, bring the changes, and and humans have got the political imagination, and they never want to be stuck in one system. And one of the basic arguments of The Dawn of Everything is that because we have the kind of minds we have, the imaginative minds we have, we want the freedom to create and recreate our political systems. We don't want to be stuck with one and the same system, even if it's communism. So I mean, it's just. I will say that I kind of advise comrades to read, if you've got the time. Maybe not now. There's probably too much practical work to do and support picket lines and other things to do at the moment. But I mean, one thing about Graeber is that he's interesting. He does a lot of reading. Nearly all his ideas are completely fresh, coming from. You wonder where they're coming from, but they're kind of. You could say they're kind of bourgeois, which I think they certainly are. But they're certainly an interesting version of bourgeois ideology. And in order to firm up our own understanding of communism, it's well worth reading both that and particularly The Dawn of Everything. Now, one more thing. One of the reasons I wanted to call this original communism, and also when everyone's king, no one's king, was because this whole question of kingship really does come into the debates that Graeber and Wenger are involved in. But actually, I think they're quite important debates, even if Graeber hadn't existed, it'd still be important. But let me just say, in this book here on kings by Marshall Salins and David Graeber, actually, again, it's very interesting. And what they say here, what Graeber and Salins says, and Graeber continues to say in The Dawn of Everything, is that one reason we can say there are no egalitarian societies, there have never been any egalitarian societies, is because even hunter-gatherers, perhaps even especially hunter-gatherers, people that are often described as egalitarian, they have religion. And in this book, we're told that religion is the state. And they're kind of inseparable concepts. You can't talk about the origin of the state because the state is like religion, same thing. And humans have always had certain concepts, which are religious concepts, such as the idea that some things are sacred. Actually, Graeber and Wenger argue about that topic, some things are sacred. Well, Emil Durkheim, the sort of founder of academic sociology, kind of following Marx, but in a rather different way. Emil Durkheim argued that things or people that are designated sacred are in some sense set apart. And very often, and Durkheim again says this, one of the ways to set people apart is to mark them as set apart, typically with blood. So women are set apart, kind of sacred, every time they menstruate in the traditional culture. But animals, when they're killed, they're kind of set apart in the sense that you have to respect the blood in much the same way that you respect menstrual blood. And there's all kinds of taboos around how you treat the animals, as if the animals had a soul. But so you have this idea that some things are sacred. And Graeber says it's very much like if you own a private car, you've got the keys to that car. The car is set apart from the general public. And Graeber is arguing that Durkheim is making the point that private property is as ancient as religion, because religion sets things apart in much the same way that private property is a way of setting something apart, namely your house, your car, your private property, your keys to it, and so on and so forth. I mean, it is the most convoluted, and I mean, in my view, upside down argument, because of course, in no sense, I mean, Graeber wasn't particularly a communist, but he was kind of on the left, and he certainly had an idea of the importance of collective action as foundational to religion. And his notion of setting things apart is exactly the opposite of Graeber's. I mean, Durkheim was saying things which are set apart, because they're set apart, because they're sacred, they can't be privatized. So when a lake, when a tree, when a particular productive area of land for hunting or foraging is set apart, that means it doesn't belong to a single person. It can't be privatized and used to exercise power. But somehow or other, Graeber manages to turn that into its opposite. And then throughout this book, we have the idea that there can be no egalitarian societies. There never were any egalitarian societies because hunter-gatherers are subordinate to kings. They have kingship. And again, it's a nice, interesting idea. Oh, I didn't realize that hunter-gatherers had kings. And we're told in this book, absolutely explicitly, yes, they have kings. It's just that their kings that stay up in the sky, and we call them gods or spirits or totems. But the argument in the book is that if you believe in the gods, the spirits, the totems, they're just as real as a king who has a body. And in fact, it doesn't really matter that the king has a body. The king's body is not what's important. What's important about a king is not that he goes to the toilet and gets old and dies. What's important about a king is all his immortal aspects and his supernatural potency. And if you believe in all that, then you're subordinate to the king. And if you're subordinate to a king, you can hardly call that egalitarianism. I imagine all of you here are sort of scratching your heads a bit about all this. It is all very, very strange. But these ideas can only have been written up by two writers who know nothing whatever about hunter-gatherers. So let me just say, and I'm relying in part on my colleague Jerome Lewis's work here, but it's common knowledge. Hunter-gatherers don't have gods. They have the idea that some things are sacred, sure enough, but in place of gods, they have what's called the trickster, perhaps several tricksters. And these tricksters are figures of fun. They're figures of ridicule. They're constantly making a mess of things, but they also kind of create the world. So the trickster creates the world, but he gets everything wrong. He makes a fool of himself. And as Jerome Lewis, he says, when you're with a Benjeli in the Congo, you party with the gods, you play with them, you laugh at them, you shout at them, it's nothing like being subordinate to a god. The trickster is a figure of fun, and it's part of the idea that you laugh at anyone who gets above themselves, and laughter is the critical device for maintaining communism. It's like anyone who starts getting a bit above themselves, they just become a figure of absolute ridicule, and women's laughter in particular. Just no man wants to be laughed at. So anyone who starts to throw his weight around, he's just regarded as making a complete fool of himself. And that's reflected in what's often called the religion of hunters and gatherers, which is as I say, their gods are kind of idiots. They're kind of all powerful in some ways, but they're completely powerless because they keep making a mess of everything. And so the trickster, he's a male who turns into a female, turns back into a male, and a human who turns into an animal, turns back into a human again. They're kind of constantly betwixt and between. And you can see how logical that is in a society which is as fluid and creative and non-static or hierarchical as any hunter-gatherer society. I should perhaps stress, when I say hunter-gatherer, I'm talking about immediate return hunter-gatherers. There are hunter-gatherers who are on the way to becoming sedentary and hierarchical and so on, particularly say the northwest coast of the United States and Canada. So as soon as you get the accumulation of property, maybe stored salmon in the case of those northwest coast Indians, then you're going to begin to go down a road in the direction of something often resembling feudalism, but where it's immediate return. In other words, we hunt the animals, and within a day or two, the meat is all being cooked and eaten, and then you've got to organize another hunt in a week or two. And those kinds of societies, before methods of preserving food, which, and of course, if the food is plentiful as it would be among forest people, perhaps I should stress that Jerome describes the Benjeli, the people he's spent many decades living with, as living in not just abundance, but superabundance. They just cannot understand how anyone could starve. They've just got no concept of hunger or starvation because the forest is so generous. I mean, and the people live under conditions where there's absolutely no point in and no sense in competing over bits of food and stuff. And whatever a man kills in terms of an animal, that meat will be shared around among in the entire camp. And that method of sharing is called demand sharing. It's just as soon as somebody is perceived to have a little bit more than they need, everyone just comes up and demands it. It's actually quite difficult for the anthropologist because it's quite difficult to make sure that your camera or various other things you think are very important for you aren't just handed around the whole camp. And so you have to make sure that, as Darwin described it, you've got plenty of tobacco on you and stuff, and because they just won't let you have anything which they think they need and that you've got and they don't have. So that's the method. So demand sharing is the sort of economic mechanism for making sure that communism prevails, and laughter is that kind of the political method, making sure that no one gets above themselves. So again, so often in what Graeber writes, there's kind of some grain of truth in it, and it's usually an interesting grain, and it's all put completely upside down and turned into its opposite. So one of the interesting things is this idea of a pendulum, because and now get into this discussion of gender, and I'm again going to rely fairly heavily on the work of Jerome Lewis. I think Jerome Lewis has spoken to Communist University, or at least a lot of you will know of his work. He spoke to Red Line TV, for example. You do have a kind of pendulum of power, and it's sort of monthly, and it takes the form of a gender pendulum. So what will happen is the women in the camp will need to make sure that their point of view is understood, their interests are understood, their dignity and pride is recognized, and they do it. They do it through a ceremony called ngoku, and ngoku is basically it's just the women's spirit, and the word spirit here is not kind of spiritual in this sort of mystical sense. It's just that the women have a spirit, and it's a spirit of solidarity, gender solidarity, so they'll just they're all kind of dressed up, rather provocatively sexy. Dancing, wiggling around, being quite taunting of the men, and in fact, as they storm into the camp, the men get quite scared. They take their sons away. And there's a lovely film. There's a lovely bit of footage of film. Some communists might be interested in. You can kind of look it up. We'll talk about that later. But what happens is the men are kind of having to put up with a lot of insults, basically. So the women are making all kinds of comments about male anatomy and physiology and male's performance on that level, and it's a raucous, laughing invasion of men's space, and the men put up with it for several days. And one of the reasons why the men can put up with it is because the women get kind of tired after a while. They've made their point. They rule the whole camp for a while on that ritual basis. And then they begin to feel, well, what's the point of carrying on? We've made our point. And so they surrender the power, and after a while, maybe a couple of days or two, the men do their ritual, ejengi, and the men's ritual is again they sort of strut their stuff, they stamp and march around in a very sort of coordinated way, having a huge lot of sort of male sort of pleasure, as demonstrating their fitness and their muscularity, and therefore, of course, their capacity as hunters and defenders of the camp. And then after a ejengi has been performed, once again the men sort of, okay, we made our point, and there's this pendulum, and in between times you get kind of normal life, but the pendulum of power moving between the women and the men is roughly lunar, roughly monthly. So it tends to be a melobi, a dark moon ritual, where the men appear as kind of spirits, but I mean, it's kind of obviously the older women know pretty much what's going on, and the whole religion is just it's not bowing and scraping to fixed gods. The Bengeli have no separate concept or word for religion, which doesn't also mean child's play. So children love to play around, they love to play fight, boys and girls kind of have the sort of group fights against each other, but it's all very playful. And then as people grow up and become adults, that pleasure in play takes the form of what we in the West might call ritual or religion or something, but for the Bengeli, it's still play. and they just enjoy being playful. And the spirit of and creativity of play and song and dance, everything kind of sexy, but and kind of erotic in a sort of way, just because everyone's conforming with kind of their natural impulses. But on the other hand, each sex constrains the other. For each sex, there's certain kind of what I've called red lines beyond which you don't go. And so instead of having a kind of thing called political correctness or gender egalitarianism, it's like a rigorous things you mustn't do. Actually, people do those things, the things they mustn't do, because they are things you should do or can do according to the period you're in. And this pendulum keeps everything going. And Morna Finnegan, one of us activists in RAG, Morna Finnegan, she calls this communism in motion. So you assert your communism, you surrender it, but you only surrender it when you're absolutely confident you can restore it again. So it's as if women form their picket line, because that Ngoku is a kind of picket line. The women are very, very solid, connected with each other, kind of being provocative, erotically, but they're not going to let any man touch them for the moment. So they do that and make their point. But then once they made their point, they kind of surrender. And they surrender to eventually sex. But of course, it's not surrender. Everyone kind of likes one form or another of sex at some point if they can have it. And so but they don't surrender until they have they have to be completely confident. Next dark moon, we're back on that picket line again. There's going to be another Ngoku. We let the men have their fun, have their ajengi, strut their stuff, make their point. But we're not going to surrender until confident that we can restore our communism, if you like. So you have a kind of period of communism, you let it go, everything's much more sort of easygoing, and you get a pulse. And of course you can argue, and I would argue, anything living has a pulse, including a living planet. As soon as a planet or an animal or a creature lacks a pulse, you can pretty much say it's probably dead. And one of the great tragedies of capitalism, of course, is it's 24/7, insecurity, work, lights on, and we are increasingly losing a pulse, which is of course a sign that we're in danger of extinction as a living planet. Kind of another issue, but all these issues are of course connected. One of the things which annoyed me in the book on kings and in the Dawn of Everything is that there's an assumption made by Graeber and Salins, and I think Wenger as well, that kingship is normatively and originally and kind of intrinsically male. You have kings, divine kings perhaps in the early stages, but queens are kind of a bit odd according to their argument. And they even quote Fraser, just Sir James Fraser, on some of these topics in relationship to kingship. And let me just say a little bit about this. One of the reasons I'm bringing in the question of kingship is because, perhaps I'll refer to the title of the talk I've given here when I talked about when everyone's king, no one's king. One of my colleagues, friends, anthropologists I hugely admire, Richard Lee, Canadian communist, who's the author of many books on primitive communism, many articles on primitive communism and books on hunter-gatherer societies in general. So he is himself a communist traditionally, and as I say, probably the most prolific writer on the topic of primitive communism. And he makes the point that he stayed a long time with the Kalahari San people, Bushman people, but he was also a friend of James Woodburn, studied the Hadza, people that I know about a little bit. And one of the things that Lee describes is the degree to which laughter makes the world go round. And he describes this, all kinds of different stories. But when a man kills an animal and comes back, kills an antelope, for example, comes back to camp, and they all say, how did it go? He has to sort of say, well, no, I didn't catch anything. No, I wasn't lucky. No, I seem to have missed all the time. But maybe you'll find a little bit of some scraggy little creature out there or something. And of course, he's killed an eland or some extraordinarily, fatty animal. So the people that they go out there and they find this animal and they say, oh yeah, you're right, it's rubbish. Oh, it's got no, it's just skin and bone. What's the point of what's the point of bringing this back to camp? So they're constantly kind of rubbishing the success of hunters, and it's just to make sure that no one gets too big for their boots. No hunter gets the idea that because he's been successful in the hunt, that somehow gives him some sway or power. So the whole idea of man the hunter, I mean, of course the men do hunt, but they've got to be, but in order to be accepted by the community and particularly by the women, they've got to prove that they're modest and generous and self-deprecating, and they've got to laugh at themselves, So that's one of the points that Lee makes. But another point he makes is about kingship, because he described a situation where he'd been told by people back home in Canada, oh no, you'll always find a headman. You'll always find any group of what you call communist hunter-gatherers, egalitarian hunter-gatherers. You'll always find that there's a headman. You just have to go there and ask who's the headman, and you'll find who's effectively, if you like, to use another language, of course, a sort of 18th, 19th century language. Who's your king? And so he describes, there's a whole article about this, I won't go into it all, but he describes all the different ways in which everyone says, no, he's not the king, no, he's not the headman, all the people who've been designated as headmen. And then he comes to an informant finally, and he's very surprised at the response of this particular man, who says, yeah, of course we have headmen. And Richard Lee's a bit upset about this, oh my God. But anyway, he says, of course we have headmen. In fact, we are all headmen. Each one of us is headman over himself. So I'm saying this to say that there's a kind of sense of being royal, being part of a royal family, of having all the privileges of royalty, but they're spread around. Everyone feels that they are, I won't use the word king or queen because that's not the language they would use, but there's aspects of what in other societies you call royalty, which is having this dignity, this respect, this power, which under monarchy only the king or only the queen has. So so the rest of society is definitely profane and not royal. With these hunter-gatherers, and I think it's true everywhere, because everyone can perform these. The place where sovereignty lies is in the dance, the ritual, and everyone can have sovereignty because everyone can do the dance. It could be the men's dance, the women's dance. Some of the dances aren't so gendered, but insofar as there's a thing called sovereignty, everyone participates in it. But more than that, they quote Fraser, Sir James Fraser's classic book, The Golden Bough, and they even quote in this book on kings. This is Sarnin's and Sarnin's engraver. They point out how the king, he's the least free person in the whole community. He's the most subject to rules. He can't. He's imprisoned. He can't speak his mind. There's all sorts of restrictions around the king, all kinds of taboos, which kind of imprison him within kingship. He's not a free person at all, even despite the power, because the power's not really. He's got power, but the power is not sort of his tactile bodily ability to enjoy himself. The power is in the institution. So you have the political king and the bodily king, of course. And what they leave out is what Fraser writes, because in the Golden Bough, George Fraser expresses his astonishment at a pattern which no one had noticed before. He was mystified to discover that the very same ceremonial treatment, now this is a great cross-cultural survey of divine kingship, conducted in the very last part of the 19th century, early 20th century, and it's based on historical records and ethnography. There's no reason to doubt it, whatever. You can say Fraser's a bit old-fashioned. He was sort of collecting items all the time, didn't have much of a theory, but still it's very influential and very interesting. So he was mystified to discover that the very same ceremonial treatment traditionally applied to menstruating maidens was meted out to divine kings and priest kings everywhere in the ancient world. So let me just, before carrying on with this quote from Fraser, one of the things which Richard Lee, who writes about primitive communism, one of the things he noticed about the Kalahari San, these are the Bushmen of the Kalahari region, Their major ritual is called the Eland Bull Dance. It's the most important ritual of the whole society. It's almost the identity of the society. If they lose the Eland Bull Dance, they're no longer themselves. And in the Eland Bull Dance, first of all, it's held when a young woman has her first menstrual period. And the point I'm kind of making is that she becomes sovereign in a particular way for the duration. What happens is that she's placed in a special hut. It's almost like the nearest they'll have to a church. Obviously, they don't build buildings; they have grass huts, but it'll be a relatively large grass hut. And she turns into her opposite. I mean, she is a human being and she's female. She turns into an animal and male. She reverses her gender identity and she reverses her species identity because she becomes their favorite animal. She becomes the eland. That's a rather slow moving, wonderfully easy to catch, very fatty antelope, the eland. And she turns into an eland, but it's a bull eland. And it's the bull eland that has the most fat and therefore is the most valued. So she turns into this creature. She's, insofar as these hunter-gatherers have a sovereign, it's this girl for the period of her seclusion, where everyone else joins in being consorting with her. So that there's no sex allowed during that period. And the reason why is because actually the women they're with something much more magical. They're with their bull, the magic bull, almost like you could almost say like they're having intercourse with God, except that God is the eland bull. And that's how the women actually play it all out. They play out that they're female elands, kind of in this intimate relationship with their bull, meaning, of course, that they're not in any kind of intimate relationship with ordinary mortal men. They're communing with, if you like, with the gods. But for the moment, there's one divine being, and that's the eland bull. So that's just to give you an example of the kind of thing that Fraser's now talking about. So he says, okay, so all right, just one more point to make is that the girl during that ceremony, she has to be in the dark. No way must the sun shine on her head, and no way must her feet touch the ground. She's between heaven and earth. She's sacred. And these rules are the most rigorous rules and taboos that the society will have. So what Fraser is describing is that the same formalities, really puzzlingly, are applied to divine kings in the ancient world. I mean, not just similar, but remarkable that they're identical ceremonial procedures. So his first example is the Mikado of Japan. Obviously, we're going back a few centuries with some of these things. Who profaned his sanctity if he so much as touched the ground with his foot. Outside his palace, he was carried on men's shoulders. Within he walked on exquisitely wrought mats. Neither was the Mikado allowed to expose his sacred person to the open air, and the sun was not thought to worthy to shine on his head. Similar precautions applied in Mexico to the supreme pontiff of the Zapotecs, who, quote, was looked upon as God whom the earth was not worthy to hold, nor the sun to shine upon. Fraser lists the king and queen of Tahiti, kings of Dosuma, Persia, Siam, and Uganda as further examples of rulers who had to be carried almost everywhere to avoid their feet touching the ground. His list of future leaders or heirs to the throne kept shielded from the rays of the sun includes Indians of Guyana, heirs to the South American thrones of Bogota and of Sogamoso, and the future Inca of Peru. Now I'm going to quote from Fraser. Now it is remarkable, continues Fraser, that these two rules, not to touch the ground and not to see the sun, are observed either separately or jointly by girls at puberty in many parts of the world. In parts of New Guinea, for example, daughters of chiefs, when they're about 12 or 13 years of age, are kept indoors for 2 or 3 years, never being allowed under any pretense to descend from the house, and the house is so shaded that the sun cannot shine on them. Among the Otdonoms of Borneo, a maiden is placed for 7 years in a cell which is raised on piles above the ground and is lit by a single small window opening on a lonely place so that the girls is in almost total darkness. I won't go through it all, but these are societies which are not egalitarian, which are becoming hierarchical, but before they have divine kings, they have these girls who are kept in a, rather like a fairy tale Rapunzel, kept in a tower. But what Fraser's pointing out is that there is just direct continuity between these women who are not queens, but they're very, very supernaturally potent women, and it's their blood that makes them potent. And then these kings who also have to shed blood in other ways. So all I'm saying here is that when Graeber and Wengrow and silently just say kingship is normatively and intrinsically male, they even quote Fraser, but sort of manage to forget to quote Fraser, because Fraser's pointing out that although it's kind of true that kings tend to be males, the rituals that they perform show continuity with the rituals performed around women who become women and therefore have to undergo rituals of seclusion, be secluded and not allowed to eat this kind of food, that kind of food, have to be carried around, must let the sun. And of course, the idea is that the light of the sun negates the critical point. The sunlight demolishes the power of the blood, and it's the power of the blood which is the critical thing in kingship. And of course, the idea that it's in the blood that the power lies has carried on to this day with our own forms of monarchy, including, of course, our own Charles III, who was, of course, king because of the blood. Leave that aside. Let me just end by saying, I started by saying we have this view that communism is kind of impossible because it contradicts human nature. So, I mean, let's just think about this for a moment. I think most people would agree that all of us feel happiest when we're among our equals, when we're with people who we can laugh with and share jokes with and share, a meal with or a drink with. And it's very difficult to laugh with your boss breathing down your neck, and it's not so easy to laugh when you've got underlings that you need to keep to manage or control. Another noticeable feature of managements and ruling elites that they're not very good at laughing, including of course, theological elites. This is one of the points that Mikhail Bakhtin makes, of course, about carnival. That carnival was the one time in the year in medieval Europe when you were allowed to turn the world upside down and have a good old laugh at the miserable, humorless bishops and lords and ladies, and have a big laugh at their expense. But the point I'm just making is that we feel, all of us, I mean, we might be, at work, having a difficult day and stuff, but what do we do when we're free? What we do when we no longer have to be at work or have to be doing what some manager tells you to do? Well, you don't go to the pub with your manager unless you're on rather unusually intimate terms and it's a rather very small business, perhaps a family business, but you want to be with your mates. And laughter is the best medicine for everything. We are a species that laughs. No other animal laughs. I mean, the chimpanzees make a sort of panting noise if you tickle them, but we have a kind of laughter which is intrinsically contagious. It's very difficult if everyone's laughing around you not to laugh just at the fact that other people are laughing. And laughing is always at somebody's expense. And when I say at somebody's expense, I think it's true to say that we laugh at people who are getting above themselves. I mean, there are all sorts of other reasons for laughter, and I've written a few things about laughter, but laughter is kind of the opposite of aggressive mobbing. It sounds like mobbing. Chimpanzees mob. They do wah, 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 but when they're angry at some dominant male messing around, making everyone laugh in misery. But the theory of laughter that I support is that if you have this mobbing sound, wah, 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 kind of rhythmic chorus aimed at some aggressor in the group, that's what chimpanzees do. Imagine what happens when you've won, when the aggressor turns tail, gives up. Well, you might want to carry on with your mobbing, but under different circumstances, when all the tension is gone and you're just mobbing as a sense of victory and relief that you actually defeated the threat. So mobbing, in my view, laughter is mobbing continued under reverse social conditions of relaxation, but you're kind of always laughing at something or somebody's expense. And as far as I can see, there's a kind of logic there, where at least in your own head, you're laughing at somebody who's trying to get away with things, trying to get above themselves. I mean, I'm sure it's a bit complicated. I'll give a different reason for laughter, but there's something about laughter which is leveling. Okay. And there's so many other things about our anatomy, as well as our biology and as well as our instincts. And one of the things, of course, we in RAG have been stressing recently is this finding made in the last 15 or 20 years about the shape of our eyes. We have eyes not just for looking out, we have eyes for looking in as well. So gorillas, chimpanzees are not communists. Let me stress that. They're very hierarchical. Gorillas are not communists. They're very hierarchical as well. A gorilla and these other great apes, they've got eyes rather like, you look at them and they're rather like mobsters wearing sunglasses. They want to look out to know what you're thinking. What they don't want is for you to look into their eyes and know what you're thinking. Well, humans are the reverse. We've got very special eyes which show the whites, and they're this shape. And it's so that we can look into each other's eyes and from the direction of gaze, infer what they're thinking. We actually want our minds to be read. We need to be mind read. We don't want to be just knowing things which other people can't know about ourselves. That's why we have language, of course, is to let other people know what we're thinking. Well, you wouldn't want others to know what you're thinking if you were in some kind of hierarchical social system. You only want others to know what you're thinking if those others are your equals and you can trust them. And there's all kinds of reasons why language as well could only possibly have evolved under situations of the kind of trust which a sharing lifestyle, a communistic lifestyle would give. So just to end, the chief value of the study of human origins is that it shows that everything distinctively human about human nature arose out of the greatest revolution that ever occurred, the human revolution, the revolution which changed the world, turned the world upside down, and thanks to which we are here today. And I've always thought that we've done that, we won that revolution a long time ago. In some important senses, it's the only revolution that actually worked. I mean, you know, the English Revolution, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, extraordinary, inspiring ideals, which are absolutely valid today. But the eventual outcomes of all those revolutions were to call them disappointing would be an understatement. The human revolution worked. How do we know it worked? Well, because here we are today with our laughter, with our eyes, with all our instincts, with all the capacities we have for gaining pleasure from each other's pleasure, from giving each other things that they need, but finding that actually that's what we need ourselves. We need to be able to, we need to feel ourselves to be creative and useful to those around us. So we did it once, we can do it again.